Welcome back to another episode of the Hustle Nation podcast. Today we are in a series, as you probably know. This is episode 5 of 6. And today we're going to talk about goals versus behaviors. And this is one you're going to want to buckle up for. This is going to be a great episode. So I want to start by talking about goals. And to me, Dustin, you and I have hammered strategy and hammered goals in this podcast in the past. But I want to start with a story that maybe some of the listeners have heard before. And I've got a deep marketing background. And when I speak on stage, one of the things I just like to ask, because I think it's so compelling and I think it's so profound, actually, that in a room recently, 220 plus people, I say, okay, raise your hand if you have a strategy. And I'm not kidding. About 10 people are raising their hand. You look around and you're counting, you're like, how could this be? There's no way. There's no way this could be. Sure, it's true. And then I'll say, okay, more importantly, keep your hand up if you have it in document format. Now we're looking at like 6 or 7 people. Now, if I were to go one step further, I would say keep your hand up if you've actually looked at it in the last 3 to 4 months. And then I'm not kidding, 3 or 4 people in the room would have their hand up. That's shocking to me because if you don't have a strategy, what is your destination? If you don't know your destination, what the hell are you supposed to do every day? How do you know if at the end of the year you were successful? How do you grade yourself? How do you decide to spend more money on certain things versus others? And so if you don't know where to invest your time or what's working and what's not, that is the definition of being in the hamster wheel, in my opinion. But I want to go one step further because strategy is one thing. And within a strategy, you have goals, or at least you should have goals. And when I'm doing any kind of consulting on a one-to-one level, I'll ask people, what are your goals? And if they have goals, they may say, well, this year, we talked about having 10% more sales. So, okay, great. That seems reasonable. However, I want to know, where did you get that number? Well, I Googled it and I looked for reasonable goals and they said 10% more sales was reasonable. Okay, based on what? Well, we thought it was realistic. Okay, but based on what? And if it's not based on historical data, which of course it's not based on trends or the fact you're going to be hiring more people for your marketing team or you're investing more in ads or insert any number of things there, it's a falsified goal. It's arbitrary. And if it's arbitrary, what is the probability you're going to achieve said goal? I would argue low single digits at best. Now, Dustin, you've got some really interesting statistics that you just reeled off a moment ago about how many people have goals. And it's just as profound as the number of people who have strategies from my lens.
For sure. I mean, this is why I hate New Year's resolutions, right? Because it's why everyone does in a lot of ways, right? Because so few people actually are able to pull through them. And it's interesting. So to your point of like what we've seen statistically. So I'm a big believer in the 80-20 rule. For those that don't know what the 80-20 rule, it's the Pareto Principle, found by Alfredo Pareto, who, beyond just having the coolest name in the world, basically found that in so many things in life, you can find the 80-20 principle where, there's 80% over here and the other 20% over here. And whether that's the 20% of inputs drives 80% of the results, or 80% of a population does this versus that. And this is absolutely true in the goal setting and achievement world, which I think is really fascinating. And what we know with the Pareto principle, right, is in the right direction, you want to be part of the 20% as much as you can, right? Because if you're in the minority in a positive way, that's going to allow you to do better things. And so when what do we know? We know that 83% of the world does not have goals at all. So 17% does. So just for ease of math, 80% don't have goals, 20% do. That's great. Then of that 20%, 80% of them just have it in their head. 20% actually write it down. So if you just have a goal and write it down, you're already in the top 3 or 4% of the world. And beyond that, we know that you're between 10 and 100 times more likely to achieve the goal once you write it down, depending on which stats you're looking at, but dramatically better. But then if we take a step further, so if we look at New Year's resolutions, I think some people say they have a goal. We know that a few of them might write something down. But then why does it die? Well, because then if you kind of break that down further, we know that of that group, only 20% are going to tie their goal to what is the behavior that I actually need to do to achieve said goal. Because that's where so many New Year's resolutions die up. It's like, oh, I want to lose weight. I want to exercise more. Be like, what does that mean? Does that mean you got to join a gym? Does that mean you got to show up to the gym? Does that mean you got to repivot your schedule, right? Like there's a behavior that you need to do in order, because all you can control is your behavior. You can't actually control the result. You can just control the behavior. Okay. So then I can be 20% of that group where, okay, I actually tie that to behavior. And then I think, and there's only 20% of that group that then looks at that once a week. And so if you're the 20% that has a goal, the 20% that has a goal and writes it down, the 20% of that has a goal, writes it down and ties it to behavior, and the 20% of that has a goal, writes it down, has the behavior, and looks at it once a week, you're in like the 0.3% of the world, and you're hundreds of times more likely to achieve your goals. And so when I think about this sickness almost that's throughout the world of people just not achieving what they want, whether it be not achieving their goals or not achieving the things they want in life, it really comes down to, if you just did those 4 things, you'd be in such a positive outlier. You couldn't help yourself but be more successful and exponentially closer to all your results. The problem is you got to do the work. And I think a lot of people, they've danced around this, but so many have stopped short. And again, my last call on New Year's resolutions, people might even write them down, which does make you more likely to achieve them. But if that's where you stopped, you still have a very good chance of failure. You take those next 2 steps, your chances of failure go down precipitously over the course of the next year, because you're constantly being reminded. And that to me is, I think, the most revolutionary thing about it is, how do you continually look to those that have already gone through the pain, have already gone through the anguish, and have found these shortcuts for you that are littered everywhere for you to really set out for your goals and knock them out of the park.
Yeah, you make an interesting point. And I hearken back to a time when I had little kids in the house, and you've got a lot going on when you've got a very young family. And I wasn't very good about being organized. I wasn't using a daily planner. And I always tell my wife I forgot something, like, oh, out of sight, out of mind. And I think that that's ultimately a BS excuse. And so I do believe firmly that writing them down is great. But a lot of people use the traditional notebook method, where they're like 10% organized, but they're not really organized, where they're just kind of writing things down and hoping they don't forget. But ultimately, that next level of keeping those goals in front of you is using a planner. And I think what's important is, we talk about this light bulb moment when we do our 2020 vision workshops, is using a planner is kind of that next step, because if you see it every single day, at minimum every single week, you can't say out of sight, out of mind. And here's what's most important, is because we've already gone from strategy to goals, and now we'll hammer into behaviors, is when you see it every day, it changes your behaviors. I would argue it also changes your mindset and your attitude, because you're reminded, yeah, I got to keep the pedal to the metal. I got to keep grinding. I've got to keep focusing on the right things. Like you mentioned earlier on with the 80-20 rule, you won't be picking the low-hanging fruit. You'll be focusing on the most important revenue generating tasks out there. And guess what? You zoom out a couple of weeks or a couple months, you're going to have this relief of burden and stress, because you've been productive and efficient for the last several weeks, just simply, like you said, Justin, by writing it down and keeping it in front of you.
Well, in many ways, this was one of the reasons we actually even decided to create our own planner, right? I mean, it was because there's a lot of planners out there. I mean, anyone could go and find 1,000 of them in 10 minutes, right? The problem with most of them is they're just calendars. They're not actually planners at all. They just, okay, I'm going to have a list taking notebook, and I'm going to have a calendaring element to it. To me, that's part of the problem. And you said it just before. I think that's one of the most critical things that at least we saw with our planner is it loops everything back continuously back to, what is your clarity vision? What are your goals? What are you trying to achieve? What are the behaviors? Do you have time allotted? Like what did you do last week? What are you doing next week? Right. Like, and that consistent cycle of finding, okay, every week I'm looking back at this, every week I'm looking back at this. And that to me is, again, that's that next piece of how do you become part of the 20% of the 20% of the 20% of the 20%, right? By following behaviors that segment has found to be super successful.
Yeah. And digging into this, I want to go back to the top of the conversation, which was strategy, then goals, and now behaviors. It's one thing just to have goals, but if you just have goals without a vision, then I don't think it's going to really be that impactful for you. But if you have the vision, which in some cases is the strategy, you have the goals within them, and then you have the daily habits and behaviors, now we're talking. And this is where I think the conversation gets interesting, Dustin, is because what we're suggesting is, documenting your day, plotting your day out in advance, tracking behaviors, not just outcomes, but behaviors, because if your behaviors are leading into related to your goals, you're going to get better outcomes. When you get better outcomes, you stack daily victories. So, as I mentioned before, you win the days, you win the week. You win the weeks, you win the month. You win the months, you win the year. And I think so often you go back to what we just talked about, which is investing in yourself. Now you feel really compelled to have a vision. Now you feel more compelled to have a meaningful goal or goals. And all of a sudden now it's like, I want to change my behaviors. Not I have to, but I want to. And it's almost like there's a mindset switch because you've seen what's possible in the first couple weeks if you have a crystal clear vision.
You bet. I mean, when you think about, what's the definition of insanity? Doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results, right? And I think a lot of times when people are going through this, they're neglecting the fact that they also have to skill up in some way, right? They have to change behavior and skill up in some way. And so how are you finding people you trust that have been there, done that have gone through these things? And that's what we've done, right? I mean, everything we've built, right, has come from some pain or anguish that we had ourselves or we learned from someone else, right? And that's true of all of us. And so how do you find ways to kind of shortcut that process? And I think when we think about the tying these things together, I think the last piece on setting goals, tying them into behaviors, keeping them in front of me, right? Like one of the other things that a lot of people will talk about is, well, I'm gonna tell those around me, right, loved ones, family, friends, that I'm gonna do this, right, because that's gonna hold me accountable, right? And there's a lot of stats to say that when you do that, that helps. But what I've seen is there's a two-edged sword to that. So one, a lot of people really hesitate to say that to other people because they're afraid they're going to fail and they don't want to tell everyone they're going to fail before they even start. Now, some that have a little bit more confidence might tell those people around them. And what we often think is that, because we tell people around them, they're the ones reminding us to do it and cheering it on and all that sort of stuff. And my experience that I've seen with myself and a lot of other people is I don't actually think that that's true. I think actually the reason when you tell other people why it actually tends to be more likely is because one, you've had confidence to verbalize it to somebody else. But then two, when you do fall off track, usually when you're telling somebody that I want to commit to this, you're also sharing with them why it's important to you. And I think that actually more often than not is what drives it is because now you're talking to people around them like, well, yeah, I mean, you said this was, they're not going to rag on you because you didn't run the marathon. They're going to run it because like, well, you said you wanted to run a marathon because you wanted your kids to be proud of you. Or you wanted to, you wanted to hold that trophy up. You wanted to prove you could do it for your own health. You wanted to prove you could do it at this own age. And I found that that's actually more the thing, which again, goes back to the 20% of the 20%, 20%, right? Like those that do all these things and have it directly tied back to their why on a regular basis, they stay more committed. They stay on top. It doesn't mean they don't fall off, but they come back to it faster, which then allows all these things to stack up and allows you to hit your goals in all these different domains.
Yeah. And I want to share another thing that's important too is that when people make strategies or when they craft our vision, they go through our workshop, it's okay to compromise, or I wouldn't say compromise, I'll say adjust and to pivot. It should happen because frankly, if your strategy or your vision ever becomes stale, which it could be in a year from now, could be different. You could be a different person for a lot of different reasons. It typically means that you're just doing the same thing over and over. The economy is going to change, the market's going to change, we change, our wants change. Therefore, our plan needs to change and evolve. And let's be honest, if this is your first crack at it, it might not be perfect, and it probably won't be. And that's fine. That is okay. But it should be getting better and better and evolving to suit your needs, to suit your schedule, to suit your wants. And along the way, I really think it's important too to celebrate the small victories, because so often, for whatever reason, a lot of us say, we'll just sweep that under the rug. We'll forget about that. We'll suppress that. If you hit a milestone, I don't care how small or how big it is, you should celebrate. Now, maybe that means, buying yourself a little thing that you've wanted for a long time, going out to dinner, having a cocktail, whatever it is, small victory, telling a friend, can make a big impact, because if you do it over and over 50 times, 100 times a year, boy, I mean, you're going to feel really successful. Even if you don't achieve your biggest goal, if you had nothing but victories throughout the year, that's a good year. It's still a good year.
That's exactly right. And you nailed it, right? This goes back to the weekly reflection. If you're looking at a weekly reflection, it allows you to not only celebrate the wins, but identify gaps faster. Because we all fall off. I mean, no matter how hard we try, it's the way our brains are wired. And this is where, how do you surround yourself with systems, structures, people, process that keep you on pace?
Okay. So if you're listening in this far, you've got through episode 5. I just want to say thank you for being with us. We're excited for you to go through this journey with us in this 6-episode series. And I encourage you all to go back and re-listen to some episodes and figure out where you need to invest the most amount of time and resources. So thanks for tuning into another episode. We'll catch you on the flip side. Peace.